she comes to us from Berkeley, where she is a professor in the Department of Ethnic Studies. She's a historian by training, right? We have a bunch of historians among our faculty, so if you read Dr. Choy's academic biography, you'll be like, oh my God. There's so much, I couldn't even begin to summarize it. She has established a number of different research centers and institutes. She has held visiting or distinguished professorships in a number of places all around the world. She's a core faculty member of the Center for Southeast Asia Studies and an affiliated faculty member of the Center for Race and Gender at UC Berkeley. Much of her work concerns the issues of race and gender as they played out in the Pacific Rim especially concerning issues of migration. So we are moving directly into engagement with wonderful folks like Amy Fan, we should never meet, which we're reading right now. Most especially for our purposes, she's written a comprehensive history of Asian international adoption in America. Please give a very, very warm welcome to Dr. Choy.
So I'm so excited to have this opportunity to present some of my findings of my most recent book, Global Families, the History of Asian International Adoption in America, as well as some of my new research in progress on Asian international adoption and artistic expression. And I'm so pleased that all of you have read or are reading Amy Fan's beautifully written collection of stories we should never meet. And I think the collection as a whole can speak to a number of things. Certainly the history of U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War, but also the impact of war on the lives of both Vietnamese and American families and children. But it also can be used as a lens to learn a little bit about, think about some of the complexities of the history of Asian international and transracial adoption. And so my talk is going to give more context about that history. Let me first just clarify the term. You have probably heard it, but transracial adoption is when parents of one racial background adopt a child of a different racial background. That's transracial adoption. I'm very grateful to the faculty and staff of Sonoma State University's first-year experience program who helped organize the lecture and bring me here, especially Professors Don Romsberg, Scott Miller, and Charlene Tung. And I want to thank all of you for being here. So I want to begin with 4 points that I make in Global Families, the book I wrote. And the first point is that the United States is an international adoption nation, being the top recipient of internationally adopted children in the world, that all of us, and not solely those who are personally involved in adoption, should know about. Second, that this phenomenon has a history, emerging out of the Cold War period from the 1950s to 1970s, and this history features the adoption of mixed-race children from Japan, Korea, and Vietnam, and of Chinese refugee children from Hong Kong. So one of the main characters, and We Should Never Meet, is one of these mixed-race adoptees from the Vietnam War. Third, even though your text is focused on Vietnamese international and transracial adoption as one topic, I want you to know that Korean international adoption is a major force in this history. Beginning in the mid-1950s, the phenomenon has spanned 6 decades and involved over 200,000 Korean children adopted by families in Western nations. As Los Angeles Times staff writer Betty Jane Levine wrote, the children of the Korean War, who were primarily adopted by white American families, became the first mass wave of international, interracial adoptions ever on the planet, the forerunner of all those that have since become commonplace. So preceding the formal adoptions that took place as a result of Operation Baby Lift. Fourth, we must pay attention to the voices and experiences of Asian adoptees. Adoptee voices are noticeably absent in most institutional and archival records. However, since the 1990s, the emergence of a sizable body of artistic work by and about Asian adoptees has challenged the representation of Asian international adoption as a quiet migration, as it's sometimes called. For this talk, I want to share with you a range of stories from and about global families, including how I, an Asian American historian who is neither an adoptee nor an adoptive parent, came to the project. So my book begins with a story about an experience I had while living in Minnesota over 10 years ago. I was finishing my lunch, about to get my 1-year-old daughter ready to visit another part of the Minneapolis Institute of Arts, and I was taken off guard by a question posed to me by a woman who I did not know. She asked me, "Where did your little girl come from?" And judging by the woman's age, early to mid-60s, I doubted she needed a lesson on sex and reproduction. Thus, I thought I had been asked a variation of the question that has been posed to virtually every Asian in the United States, whether he or she is a newly arrived immigrant or a third or fourth generation Asian American. And that question is, where are you from? This is a question for which New York City, the place of my birth and my childhood, is not the right answer. My family is originally from the Philippines, I explained. My daughter is a third-generation Filipino-American, as well as a fourth-generation Korean and Chinese-American on her father's side. And when the woman drew a blank look, it struck me that I had completely misunderstood her question. And she wanted to know from where in Asia I had adopted my daughter. She explained that her daughter had recently adopted a baby girl from China. International adoption from Asia has transformed the racial and ethnic landscape of the heartland of America to the point where, as in the situation I just described, it has become a social norm. According to a 2009 local news story, more than 13,000 Korean adoptees live in Minnesota, the largest number of Korean adoptees in any one place in the world. Asian international adoption in America is not solely a regional phenomenon, however. It has contributed to the transformation of the US into an international adoption nation. Although Russia, Guatemala, Romania, and Ukraine are also top-sending countries of adoptive children to the United States, Asian children have comprised the majority of children internationally adopted by US citizens. Between 1971 and 2001, US citizens adopted over 265,000 children from other countries. It's a significant number. And over 156,000 of those children were from Asian countries. Asian international adoption has also made a mark on our national culture. It has become a powerful way to imagine contemporary US multiculturalism because it shapes one of the most intimate institutions, the family. For example, the publicity about celebrities adopting internationally has made the American public highly aware of the possibility of families becoming transracial. However, the specter of American racism and nativism towards Asians haunts the joyous imagery of adoptive families. Since the 1990s, a growing body of memoirs, documentary films, and anthologies by primarily Korean American adoptees who have come of age underscored the theme of their numerous mundane encounters with American racism. In the first published anthology by and about Korean adoptees entitled Seeds from a Silent Tree, Korean adoptee Mi Ok-sung Bruning writes about her American childhood. Quote, "Adolescence is traumatic enough without being targeted for being racially different, culturally identified as alien, and looking like no one else, peer, child, or adult. I was stared at, harassed, bullied, called names, insulted, threatened, and verbally abused by other kids, younger and older, on a daily basis, on the school bus, in stores, restaurants, and many other public places in Rhode Island." These works remind us that the historical legacies of anti-Asian sentiment, and some examples of these are very overt anti-Asian violence, late 19th through mid-20th century immigration restriction and exclusion, and racial stereotyping of Asians in the United States as perpetual foreigners and as a yellow peril persist in more recent times. The seemingly positive stereotype of Asian Americans as model minorities in relation to negative stereotypes of African Americans adds an additional layer of complexity regarding how race informs the phenomenon of Asian international adoption. Some scholars have argued that these stereotypes undergird a racial preference for Asian children over African American children. Furthermore, the decreasing supply of white babies in the United States in the late 20th century, a result of the creation of the birth control pill, the legalization of abortion, and the increasing social legitimacy of single parenting, contributes to the commodification of Asian children for an international adoption market. Several scholars have strongly criticized international adoption by documenting and highlighting a global market that transports babies from poorer countries to richer ones, likening it to a form of forced migration and human trafficking. Thus, Asian international adoption is simultaneously highly celebrated and deeply controversial. But these international and transracial sensibilities about family making and the heated debates that they generate are not as new as they seem. They have a history. This study was primarily inspired by the time I spent living and teaching in Minnesota. First, accompanying my husband Greg when he taught at Gustavus Adolphus College in St. Peter, and then working, my first tenure-track job was as an assistant professor of American Studies at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities in the late 1990s. These places had hired us on the basis of our expertise in Asian American studies. Neither Greg nor I are part of families in which adoption has played a major role. However, we were immediately struck by the presence of especially Korean American adoptees in our undergraduate classes. They sought to learn more about their personal histories in a larger socio-historical context through Asian American studies. However, in the late 1990s, little research had been conducted about this topic in the field. Most of the scholarly studies were psychological studies that focused on the adjustment of the adoptees. I was also moved to undertake a study of this topic because of the Asian American Studies commitment to create knowledge that is relevant to the communities in which we live and serve. And while as a resident of Minnesota and as a professor at the U of M, I recognized Asian American adoptees as important members of that community. I am also a trained historian, as Professor Miller noted, and I learned that the University of Minnesota housed the records of the International Social Service USA branch in its social welfare history archives. The ISS USA was a gold mine in many ways. The scope of the collection was large. It had quite a bit of correspondence and other records that could speak to the multiple subject positions, the different takes people had, whether they were from adoption agencies or social service agencies or adoptive parents, for example. The ISS concluded that international and transracial adoption was a viable, indeed a beneficial form of making a family. Yet its official publications also strongly noted that it could also work at times against the best interests of the children, even wreaking havoc on their personal development and the lives of their families if not handled professionally and ethically. As a result of studying these records, I was able to glean the complexity of international and transracial adoption, its radical and progressive possibilities of a world profoundly united across national, cultural, and racial divides through family formation, but also its strong potential to reify the very national, cultural, and racial hierarchies it sought to challenge. I argue that the history of Asian international adoption is best understood as a unique, Sorry, has been moving. As a unique, but also increasingly normative type of family formation in our self-consciously global age. The history of international adoption speaks to the way in which family formation needs to be understood on a global social, political, and economic scale, and not solely a personal or local one. And I hope that the concept of global families connects the seemingly uncommon world of adoption to the broader forces of international migration that bind so many of us. I want to now turn to some images that are from the book. Most of these are from the book that help visualize the various stories I analyze in global families. So this is the book cover, and it features Susan T. Pettis, the ISS USA assistant director, visiting a school in Vietnam in the late 1960s. In the 1950s and 1960s, ISS USA workers were invested in the best interest of the child, which for them signified both increased social services in the birth country, in the Asian country, as well as adoption in the United States. As a result of this approach, the ISS USA produced a very different kind of practice and conversation about international adoption, which went beyond humanitarian rescue efforts, as it was typically conceptualized at this time. Their story was not as popular as other adoption advocates of this time period, like Harry Holt, who would form the Holt Adoption Program, and Pearl Buck, who would found Welcome House, in large part because the ISS USA rejected celebratory narratives about the largesse of American Christian and liberal families. And they at times criticized the actions of some potential adoptive parents and lay adoption workers. The ISS USA also anticipated the problems of racial alienation and racism in international transracial adoption in the United States. So this is a Japanese philanthropist, Miki Sawada, holding an Amerasian infant at the Elizabeth Saunders home. Beginning in the 1950s, American families began adopting children of different racial backgrounds from countries abroad in significant numbers. These pioneers of global family making adopted Japanese and Korean war orphans. However, mixed race Asian and American children in these countries soon captured the hearts and minds of the American public and became a focal point for the work of international non-governmental organizations. Post-World War II US occupation of Japan from 1945 to 1952, and US Cold War involvement in the Korean War from 1950 to 1953 created a population of mixed-race children of American servicemen and Japanese and Korean women. Japanese and Korean societies rejected these children as improper children because many of them were conceived outside of wedlock. They looked physically different. And even more importantly, they embodied the unequal political relationship between occupied and occupying nations. Although an American military presence in Japan and Korea was responsible for these children's births, the US government bore no official responsibility for the children's or their mother's welfare. Thus, both Asian and American racisms intersecting with gender hierarchies that created and stigmatized single motherhood contributed to the dire situation of mixed-race Asian and American children, sometimes popularly referred to as Amerasians. Non-governmental organizations and concerned individuals like Miki Sawada stepped in to provide some relief to the children and their mothers. Separate orphanages for mixed-race children in Japan, such as the Elizabeth Saunders Home, and special wings of orphanages in Korea offered better care for these children. Thus, international adoption and humanitarian rescue were inextricably linked during this time period. The plight of what is called GI babies persisted into the 1960s and 1970s in the context of war in Vietnam and the US military presence there. A 1972 New York Times article attributed the critical situation of mixed-race Vietnamese and African-American children to Vietnamese racial bias, implying that international adoption in the United States was the best solution. Quote, "The Vietnamese are usually prejudiced against dark-skinned races, and they do not like foreigners. Any child who grows up without a family that is the focus of Vietnamese life and is also Black confronts obstacles that a Westerner cannot imagine." Mainstream news media also perpetuated stereotypical representations of a homogeneous Asia and its people's inability to care for abandoned children in general. As one 1973 Newsweek article explained, in part, the tragic condition of Vietnamese orphanages stems from an Oriental belief that it is the responsibility of relatives, not strangers, to care for parentless children. It suggested that American Rescue might be the only option for the well-being of these children by concluding that if that help does not come from the United States, it may not come at all. By contrast, ISS USA officials presented a more complex account of the situation in Vietnam. The 1971 report entitled "The Special Needs of Vietnamese Children" by Wells Klein, General Director of the ISS USA, acknowledged Vietnam's history of contact with other racial or ethnic groups, including the French, Chinese, Khmer, and Indians. Given the history of French colonialism in Vietnam, the Caucasian Vietnamese child was not a new phenomenon, Klein pointed out. Klein did not deny the presence of racism in Vietnam, but he cautioned that given its colonial history, the futures of mixed-race Vietnamese and white American children were difficult to predict. According to Klein, potential social problems stemmed not only from racial difference, but from the stigmatization of these children as illegitimate children or as children of prostitutes. Another factor to consider was their part American nationality. Klein suggested it is possible that a growth of anti-Americanism in South Vietnam will adversely affect these children. Chapter 2 of Global Families is entitled "The Hong Kong Project," and it presents an earlier history of Chinese international adoption from Hong Kong in the 1950s and 1960s, which has been overshadowed by the more recent phenomenon of Chinese international adoption that began in the 1990s, partly as a result of China's one-child policy as well as new Chinese adoption laws. But the Hong Kong Project was a new ISS program in 1958, a two-year project that involved finding adoptive homes for several hundred abandoned and orphaned Chinese children. Although the project targeted Chinese American communities in the United States for potential adoptive parents, an increasing number of white Americans expressed interest in international and transracial adoption. Their adoption of what was called full-blooded Chinese children presented social workers with a problem regarding assessing race, assessing racial tolerance among potential adoptive parents and their communities. They held this symposium in 1959 about the adoption of Oriental children, as they were known at the time. The term Asian American does not become popular until really the 1970s. So they held this fascinating symposium in 1959 on the adoption of Oriental children, and the ISS USA workers raised the following questions that I think people are still raising in the late 20th and early 21st century about international and transracial adoption, such as, how important is it for a Chinese child adopted by a Caucasian family to retain an awareness of and pride in his Chinese heritage? Or should he be encouraged to ignore such difference? To what extent can families identify with a child markedly different in appearance when this difference is racial? How can a family's ability really to accept a Chinese child be assessed? How can a community's attitudes, trends, and degree of tolerance be evaluated? What conflicts should be expected in a Chinese child adopted by a Caucasian family? And how can the family be prepared to help deal with such difference? The ISS USA concluded that ultimately such challenges could be overcome. Emphasizing the flexibility and resilience of Chinese adoptive children, they concluded that Chinese international and transracial adoption in the US could indeed work. And given that for most of the history of modern adoption in the US had practiced racial matching, this was certainly a major break from the past and contributed to the transformation of the US into an international adoption nation. So this image is of Jim Bouton, who some of you might know, a former New York Yankees pitcher and author, and his wife Bobby and their 3 children, David, who on the left, also known as Kyung-jo, Michael and Lori out for a walk by their home in New Jersey. In the 1950s or the 1970s, mainstream journalism played a role in stereotyping international adoption through the focus on its simple joys, but it occasionally challenged this depiction with the publication of more nuanced stories. And in Global Families, I highlight the story that features former New York Yankees pitcher Jim Bouton's adoption of a Korean boy in the late 1960s. Although Bouton is best known for his controversial expose of baseball in his book, Ball 4, his family's experience with international adoption has been, for the most part, forgotten. Leonard Schechter's 1968 magazine article featuring Bouton's frank revelations about the difficult and complicated decision to adopt an Asian child and his family's struggles to raise their Korean son is a fine example of complex reportage about international adoption in mainstream media. Jim and Bobby Bouton had prepared themselves and their children for Kyung-jo's arrival. They had studied Korean language. They planned to eat Asian food so Kyung-jo would feel more at home. This well-intentioned preparation could not overcome the traumatic origins of the child's traumatic realities, of the child's origins, however. In a stunning departure from other news stories, Schechter contrasted the heartwarming adventure that the Boutons had hoped for with the heartbreak of Kyung-jo's personal history. The Boutons' welcoming gestures of language study and Asian food, quote, meant nothing to a child given up by his mother and wrenched across the Pacific to a place where all the faces were pale and all the words were incomprehensible. Kyung just cried. The inclusion of the adoptees' painful perception of the experience is strikingly different from most accounts of this time period, which represented the adopted child typically as a blank slate after his first or second day in the US. Another stunning element of Schechter's article is the discussion of Kyung-jo's Korean birth mother. Schechter explained that his mother, who was, quote, deserted by her American soldier, could barely afford to feed herself and her child. So she put him up for adoption, hoping that someone somewhere would do for him what she could not. Kyung-jo, like an untold number of children in Asian orphanages, like a number of children on Operation Baby Lift, was not a true orphan. Although Schechter did not go into any more detail about the boy's past, he highlighted the existence of this relationship, while many other news stories of the time excluded mention of the birth mother and other relatives altogether. So I want to move into some artistic expression by adoption by Asian adoptees themselves. And this is an image of the Korean adoptee and filmmaker, Diane Borche Lien. A notable absence in the archival records is the voices of adoptees. The final chapter in my book calls attention to the artistic contributions by Asian American adult adoptees for adoption studies as well as for Asian American history. The chapter features close readings of
The documentary films, First Person Plural, and In the Matter of Cha Jung-hee, that were written and directed by Deanne Bourchier Lien. And I chose these films for not only for their aesthetics, they're beautifully made films, but I also chose it for a very specific historical reason. The ISS USA, whose records I looked at, had arranged for Bourchier Lien's adoption. And because her films analyze the prominent role that institutional and organizational records played in her life history as a Korean adoptee in the US, First Person Plural and In the Matter of Cha Jung-hee offer a direct and provocative link between ISS USA organizational records and one of its adoptees speaking back as an adult. So this is a film still of Deanne when she was younger with her American siblings, Duncan and Denise, that comes from First Person Plural. The acceptance of Deanne into an all-American Bourchier family is on one important level a radical and progressive departure from late 19th and early 20th century vehement anti-Asian sentiment. Yet First Person Plural also illuminates how the specter of anti-Asian racism haunts Deanne's integration into her new American family and community. So when Denise, her American sister, who's featured here, when Denise reminisces in the film, people would see us and ask, "Is that your sister? You guys look just alike." The film exposes the fallacy in this statement by illustrating the difficulty and hard work invested by Deanne to look like her white American sister and peers. A major part of Deanne's American childhood was spent trying to look like everyone else by perming her naturally straight hair, wearing makeup to make her eyes look bigger, and even having cosmetic surgery done on her ears. Deanne also acknowledges the existence of an emotional distance between her and her American parents. This is when she's already an adult. A distance stemming from racial differences and her vulnerability when she was a child. Although the buildup to the encounter between Deanne's Korean and American families is emotionally tense, Deanne, viewers learn, is also not a true orphan. She does have her birth mother still living and birth siblings still living. The reunion between her American and Korean families is cordial, and the families interact with one another respectfully. First Person Plural presents viewers with the possibility of dialogue between family members about the difficult issues of relinquishment and estrangement. But it also compels viewers to confront and to think more deeply about the significance of racial difference and the unequal political economy of international adoption. Much has changed in international adoption since the 1970s and since events, historic moments like Operation Baby Lift. First, the phenomenon has become a truly global industry. The few thousand international adoptions that took place from the 1950s to the 1970s, mostly in the context of war, pale in comparison to the tens of thousands in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Second, the national origins of adoptive children in the US have become much more diverse, involving different regions of the world. Specific Asian nations continue to supply adoptive children. China, Vietnam continues to do that. Korea, the number has been decreasing, although they still send children abroad in the 21st century. But we also have Eastern European, Latin American, and African countries becoming important sources for adoptive children. Third, other countries have become important receiving nations of internationally adopted children. In Spain, international adoptions nearly tripled by 2004, making Spain the second largest receiving country after the United States in terms of actual number of international adoptions. Finally, new controversies have emerged, such as the question of gay and lesbian adoption. In their 2009 anthology, Laura Briggs and Diana Mare observed that, quote, the ability of gay men and lesbians to adopt seems to be expanding within some countries. A third of the EU countries and South Africa now allow this practice, at the same time that it is contracting elsewhere, as conservative religious groups in the US struggle to outlaw it. After the exponential growth of international adoption between 1998 and 2004, a decrease in numbers in 2005 and 2006 affected many receiving countries. However, current demographic trends cannot undo the Cold War history and legacy of international adoption in the US. International adoption continues to influence the American experience through the presence of multiple social networks that serve global families and the multiple generations we have now of Asian American adoptees who are adults. Most adoptees are no longer children, even though we tend to conflate that category together. And they are creating new forms of kinship with fellow international adoptees through the formation of adoptee-focused organizations and through artistic expression. So I'm in the early stages of working on another book-length project that continues its focus on international adoption, but I'm very interested in how adoptees who are artists, how they communicate adoption or use the theme of adoption in their work. And I wanted to end by highlighting several adopted Vietnamese artists and some of the work that they're doing. And so the first artist I want you to know about is Jared Rehberg, who's a Vietnamese adoptee and also a singer-songwriter. And I'm quoting from his website. You can Google his name, get his website, and learn more about his work and his music. Jared Rehberg is a Vietnamese adoptee singer-songwriter based in New York City. Also known as Vu Thien An, he was born in Saigon, Vietnam in 1974. With the love and support of An Lac Orphanage mothers Betty Tisdale and Madam Nye, Jared came to America in April of 1975 during the week of Operation Baby Lift. Inspired by a reunion of adult adoptees in 2000, Jared's life work was born. He continues to speak and perform his original songs about his adoption journey. In 2003, he released his first CD, Waking Up American, and following up with Somewhere in the Middle in 2010. Jared is currently the co-director at the Vietnam Camp for Heritage Camps for Adoptive Families in Colorado, and is a member of the board of a nonprofit called Against the Grain Productions, which released a documentary film on Operation Baby Lift in 2009. And this is just an excerpt of lyrics from a song he wrote featuring Heather Park entitled Invisible. And so I'll just share this excerpt with you, but you can find the full lyrics online. I'm not invisible. I'm right here. I'm not a child. You don't have to speak for me. I will be counted. You can count on me. I will be here. Are you listening to me? To me. I don't want to hear somebody try and tell you how I feel. They call us, quote unquote, angry every time we disagree. I can tell you where it hurts. I can tell you what's wrong. We're all grown up. It's been hard moving on. And the other artists I want you to know about, and I'll conclude with them, is illustrator Jessica Emmett and writer Bert Ballard. And together they've created Adopted, the comic. And this had a run from 2009 to 2013, but you can still see it online. And I'm going to quote from their webpage that describes them. So this is first a description about both of them. We are both Vietnamese adoptees. Bert, the writer, is based in the USA, and I, Jess, the illustrator, am the artist based in the UK. Me and Bert connected when I submitted some artwork for a book for adopted teens he edited called Pieces of Me, which came out in 2009. It also turns out that he was part of AVI, Adopted Vietnamese International, a group I had been a part of for over 7 years. We just never really had the chance to talk before I submitted work to the book. It's funny how these little connections and chance encounters to people happen. And this is specifically from the webpage about Jessica Emmett. I am currently a freelance illustrator, designer, and artist based in the UK. I'm adopted. My birth mother was a Vietnamese refugee that fled to Hong Kong after the Vietnam War. I was adopted at the age of 1 by a British couple who were living and working in Hong Kong. I also have a younger sister that is a Hong Kong adoptee. When I started to become interested in adoption and started to explore the different resources out there way back in 2003, I struggled to find things I related to. Adoption is a serious issue, and many of the resources reflected that. Of course, I think very deeply about adoption, but sometimes I feel it's easy to get caught up in it all. I believe that if you are able to laugh at yourself, then you can truly accept yourself. I had no idea if an adoption comic would work, or if it would only be funny to me. I hope you enjoy the comic as much as I love drawing for it. And this is from the webpage, I'm just quoting the webpage of Bert Ballard. I'm an adoptee from Vietnam, one of the children evacuated during Operation Baby Lift in 1975. I grew up in the United States. I have helped form 2 adoptee-led organizations, the Vietnamese Adoptee Network and International Adoptee Congress. I have been published in Adoption Parenting and Adoption Today magazine, and have spoken across the US and Canada to numerous adoptive parents and adoption professionals sharing my experiences as an adoptee. So this is the last slide, and it's from Adopted the comic. And this is Bert and Jess talking to one another. Bert says, I'm a Vietnamese adoptee, and Jess says, me too. And Bert says, I also, let's see, this is hard for me to see. I also do work about adoption. Jess says, me too. And he said, I always wanted to do an adoption comic. Jess says, me too. And then he says, I was adopted in May. And Jess says, me too. And then Bert says that he's returning to Vietnam to adopt his son. And Jess says, well, I guess, I'm paraphrasing here because it's hard for me. She says, okay, so I shouldn't assume that just because we're both adopted, that we have everything in common. And this is titled In Common. I'll just end with a short thing about Bert Ballard. He wrote, all this is to say that I take my adoption very seriously, but I also think that humor and the ability to laugh at ourselves is key to our healing. Laughing at ourselves gives us perspective and the ability to step back and not take ourselves too seriously without minimizing the importance of the topic. Thank you very much for listening. Oh, we do. Yeah, we just have a few minutes. How long do we have?
About 5 minutes.
Okay, I could take maybe 1 or 2 if they're short, but I'm happy to take questions. Does anyone have a question or comments also? It's fine too.
I have a question.
Sure.
So, can you say a little bit about, I'm just trying to put it all together. It sounds like the current state right now is that there really isn't, relatively speaking, historically speaking, a great deal of adoption from Asian countries into America. Is that correct?
Definitely been decreasing by a significant amount. Yes.
Do you think, are the reasons for that largely stemming from policies in the countries in Asia or from changed attitudes toward adoption in the United States?
Yeah, absolutely both. There's definitely changing policies in top Asian sending countries like China, for example, started to change its policy to restrict who could adopt. And there were a number of tight restrictions, even down to one's weight, that one could no longer be a single parent. One had to show a certain amount of income. My understanding in the case of Vietnam also, the Vietnamese government has particular kinds of restrictions regarding international adoption that they try to limit that adoption to older children and special needs children. So it's absolutely changing policies, but also changing socioeconomic conditions in Asia. And some places like South Korea are highly modernized and strong economically. And so they don't have the same kinds of socioeconomic conditions that were pushing so many children out. But there is also changing attitudes, not just in the United States, but also internationally. And so there have been international agreements among countries who are very concerned about some of the historic abuses that have been related to international adoption. And by abuses, I'm talking about human trafficking and the commodification of selling children. Of course, that's not the intent of international adoption, but it has led to a number of cases with that practice. And so internationally, governments as well as communities are also trying to reduce fraud and the exploitation of children, and that has resulted also in the reduction of numbers.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
So there is a roundtable today. I know that Dr. Choy would be very interested in talking a little bit more about specific interactions between We Should Never Meet and the story of international adoption that she's told us. And Jason still has his the petition that he told you about. Thank you so much, Dr. Choy.